The early light shone through glassless windows into a cramped space filled with elders and scribes. The whole council was present, and they held a consultation deliberating on the guilt of the accused. Jesus stood quietly. As they argued in hushed tones with furtive glances cast toward him, Jesus waited, alone, in the midst of those he was meant to save. They came to a decision a short time later, and being of one mind, they ordered the guards to bind Jesus and lead him to Pilate, the governor. The room quickly emptied, and the officials flowed onto the road leading to the governor's estate. No one spoke to him along the way. Strangers' eyes averted his searching gaze. Instead, people pridefully stared toward their destination. The brisk morning was a physical manifestation of the emotional atmosphere. Very little warmth left in the world, a biting chill cut through his clothing, and the air was tinged with death. They arrived before Pilate. Voices shouted over one another, demanding Jesus' death. "He deserves to die," someone screamed from the back of the procession. Others took up the cry. Pilate, hearing their demands, had Jesus led to a place called the Pavement, and Pilate sat himself upon the judgment seat. A few moments later, Pilate rendered his judgment. Jesus the Messiah was to be crucified.
Pain racked his entire body as the final cord bound Jesus' torso to the cross. Made of cedar, pine, and cypress, the wooden burden begged to break Jesus as he struggled to his feet. He was exhausted and heartbroken, yet determined. With 1,000 splinters seeking his bones, Jesus raised himself up and stepped into the mid-morning sun. The day was warming. There was very little wind to subdue its effects. The brisk air from the morning had lost its cooling effect. The angry mob began following him to Golgotha, the place of the skull, where only the most heinous of offenders were taken. As if the excruciating weight of the cross wasn't enough, the crowd around him began to snarl obscene and hateful statements. He marched forward in death's procession. He said nothing. It had come to this, he knew, and he remained silent, save for the ragged breaths that escaped him every other step. I must be obedient through this suffering, he thought. I do this for them. I do this for them.
Drenched in sweat and no small amount of blood, Jesus tried to keep walking, stumbling a more appropriate term at this point. He could hardly breathe. The cords around his arms and wrists cut into him like ropes of fire, burning his skin and mingling with his blood underneath. The uneven ground at his feet sloped slightly, and he lost his balance. The rocks and dirt raced towards his face as no one attempted to catch him. The crushing weight of the cross slammed into his back and pinned him to the pavement. Jesus cried out. No one answered. Not gently, the surrounding guard wrenched him from the ground's embrace and pushed him forward. "Keep walking," was the only encouragement he received. Taking a deep breath, he staggered forward. I do this for them.
Laboring to keep his feet, Jesus looked up for the first time in what felt like hours. The sun nearly blinding him, he could only make out silhouettes of the bystanders he passed, and yet one stood out. A woman's familiar face filled his vision. Her eyes were drowning in despair as she saw the face of her beaten child. As their gazes locked, the pain he felt was no longer his own. On her face, he saw torture like none he had felt. He saw the helplessness and agony painted in lines that drew her mouth into a rictus of horror. His mother. They've done this and more to me, but the price exacts his toll on her. Mother, be not afraid, he remembered saying with a hoarse whisper as he passed her by. I love you, and I love them. I do this for all of you. Father, be with her, hold her, save her from drowning in a vast sea of ruin. Comfort her and keep her safe, please. He barely heard her moans of despair as he continued on. He had to finish this. He had to save them all.
Chancing a glance at the sky, Jesus saw that the sun approached the height of noonday. He felt like he had been marching for much longer, but it had been only 3 hours. He could no longer feel his arms or legs due to the numbing effects of the cross. As he looked back toward the ground, his eyes registered what his mind could not. He didn't recognize his own feet, battered and bruised as they were, and they weren't moving. The shouts came to him then, find someone, anyone. Yes, yes, he'll do. The weight of the cross seemed less all of a sudden, then disappeared entirely. Jesus, confused, looked up again. Simon of Cyrene had been traveling for many weeks to get to Jerusalem. The road had been difficult. Thieves seemed to lurk at every bend during the day. And at night, the howls and gurgling of strange creatures chased away any thoughts of sleep. He was tired, but looked forward to worshiping at the temple. And so he pushed onward. As he approached the crowded path he'd seen from the hilltop, Simon curiously prodded his way through the throng. What is this? What's happening, he thought. Suddenly, and without warning, 2 things happened at once. First, Simon heard someone shout, yes, yes, he'll do. And then Simon of Cyrene was snatched away from the onlookers around him. Panic threaded through him as they bound him to a monstrous object made from various types of wood. He cried out that he didn't do anything, that he was an innocent traveler. But no one seemed to care. To his right, he caught sight of what had to be the cause of this calamity, a broken and bloodied man staring at the ground, dripping sweat and swaying from fatigue. The man's arms bore the track marks of the cord being wrapped around Simon's own, and his legs looked as though they had been raked across a dry riverbed. Suddenly, the man looked towards him, and Simon froze. Peace like none he had ever experienced washed over Simon in a pressing wave. Pain was non-existent. As he looked around, the colors were more vibrant, the air smelled clean, and the harsh sounds of the surrounding crowd faded out. More importantly, he could no longer feel the weight of anything. He looked back at the man, and a voice spoke in his head. "This is my son, my beloved. In him I am well pleased." Was that? No, it was. The voice of God boomed gracefully in his mind. He knew without a doubt that carrying this man's burden would be the most important moment of his life. He stopped struggling, staring instead into the blazing eyes of the man whose physical burden he now bore. Without words, Simon, now affixed to what had been called a cross, stepped forward. Jesus, watching the man Simon, who was now burdened by the cross, spoke to him, "Father, aid him. Help him feel no pain as he walks. Guide his feet and let him be at peace." This is our burden. Let us bear the pain of it for him. Being pushed from behind, he stumbled after Simon, content to know that the man would bear his cross, but not his pain.
The procession advanced. The jeers from surrounding spectators intensified with every step, as did Jesus' torture. Simon of Cyrene still walked upright, bearing his burden as though it were little more than a travel pack. The divine Jesus was grateful for the man's ease. The human Jesus was in agony. His face streamed with rivulets of sweat and blood, commingling with the dusty air to create a muddy bark, caking onto his skin. He could barely see through the mask. Suddenly, the procession slowed. As Jesus glanced upward, a cool fabric, wet with clean water, met his face. A woman, Veronica was her name, wiped the grime away and restored some dignity to the marred visage of Christ. "I don't understand why they do what they do, teacher. Our humanity seems to have left us." Shoved out of the way by the nearest guard, Veronica faded into the crowd behind. Jesus stumbled forward once more, beaten and nearly broken. I do this for her. I do this for all of them.
A second time. Air. He needed air. Between the dust kicked up by the procession's relentless pace and the blood clogging his nose and streaming into his mouth, Jesus was fighting for breath. He was thirsty. He was tired. He was hurting. He faltered. It happened so fast he didn't have time to register what occurred until it was too late. He had stumbled to the side, missing a step, and the guard with whom he collided shoved him back into the path. Unable to catch the movement with his balance, Jesus fell hard. Wind escaped his lungs like it was drawn out by a bellows. Muscles begging for oxygen, bones creaking with exhaustion. He couldn't do anything but lie still. Calloused hands drew him up almost immediately. His rest was short, and violently guided him until he found his feet. Placing one beleaguered foot in front of the other, Christ advanced, suffering, pain, agony. Why? I will continue for them. I will die for them.
The sun beat down its harsh rays of punishment as the hours gave birth to the afternoon. Jesus had no more water to make sweat. Weakened and weary, he plodded on. Simon, carrying the cross in front of him, had begun to weep. Jesus knew these tears weren't from physical pain, and he blessed the man for seeing the situation as it was. Sighing, Christ chanced a look behind him. Simon's weren't the only sounds of mourning. A little way behind, a group of women moaned and cried out in sorrowful lament. "Let him be," they cried. "Stop this madness." Christ stopped. Knowing it would earn him a sharp jab and more pain, he stopped all the same. "Do not weep for me, women of Jerusalem, not one tear. What I do for you." The women halted and stared, struck silent. "If you must weep," he told them, "weep for your children and your children's children. Theirs is the burden of knowing the truth of today, not yours. I do this for you. I do this for them." The guards, shaken by his words, waited for him to turn and walk again. No one touched him.
It no longer made sense. Why was he here? Where was here? The muffled sounds around him, he knew those. I'm being marched to death, he remembered. Suddenly and without warning, his knees buckled. He was done physically, but he knew he had to keep going. He knew he had to finish. Distantly, he felt the kicks to his side and the blows to his head. Get up! Get up! It wasn't the guards. They had stopped beating him so they wouldn't have to carry him. It was the people surrounding him. Faces marred with anger spat upon him as bystanders became participants in his torment. He barely felt the blows. He was barely breathing. He couldn't move. Slowly, the beating stopped. Distorted sounds filled his ears as his bloodshot eyes watched the crowd around him dissipate. Guards took him by the arms and shoulders and drew him up. He could see the destination ahead, Golgotha, the place of the skull. His prayers seemed to fall away, shut out. Help wasn't coming, at least not help for him. He stood firmly and walked forward. Only a few more steps now.
It was early afternoon when they arrived. Laborers mulled about, giving perfunctory nods to the prepared hole into which the cross would be set. The heat of the now windless day sapped every drop of water from the air. Breathing seemed to cook Jesus' lungs. They had finally stopped moving. Simon had been relieved of the cross and was standing apart from the onlookers, eyes dried out from tears given along the way. As he looked around, the people had fallen into a quiet expectation. No one looked away. No one spoke. No one moved. A brief respite. The guards, seemingly remembering their orders, half-dragged a weary Jesus to the foot of the hole. They ripped off his garments one by one, with no regard for his dignity. As he lay there, left only in threadbare garments, his tormentors cast lots for his clothing. They cast lots for my clothing. Hadn't he read that in Scripture? Yes, he had. This was a line directly from Isaiah. Lying nearly naked, shuddering with pain, Jesus watched them. He watched as they concluded their game and turned their attention back to him. One approached bearing a circlet of thorns woven together to mock the shape of a crown. With fetid breath, the man whispered as he came close to Jesus' face, "This is for you, your majesty." With a heavy push, the thorny halo sunk into his head. New wounds emitting fresh rivulets of blood, which flowed down and washed away the dirt from his face. As they brought him to the cross, he thought, "Today, the Scripture has been fulfilled in your actions. Let us finish this."
Pain, terrorizing, unyielding, unmitigated pain. Nails the size of a man's forearm are driven through Jesus' hands. Each clang of the hammer resounded. In a high-pitched ringing within his ears, a deafening scream replaced his sobs, and a crying out so dismal and hopeless that the sky seemed to take note. Darkening with every increasing pitch, the wood and his bones splintering with every blow. And Jesus passed out between connections, like molten steel caught between hammer and anvil. Christ's body was the object being shaped to fit the cruel wood of the cross. Once attached, the soldiers lifted Christ and the cross and slammed them both into the ground, hanging there for all to behold. Numbness returned to his appendages. Looking down, he noticed the shelf slightly below his feet. This was reachable with the front pads of his feet and allowed him to take the weight off his body. Soon, he wouldn't have enough strength to hold himself up. Then, he would suffocate from the weight of his own mass. The men hanging on either side of Jesus began to shout to him. On the left, one disparaging him, echoing the crowds who were telling him to save himself if he was the Son of God. The other, another thief, stole his final breaths and asked Jesus to remember him. And then he died. Christ looked out across the mass of people that he could feel their bloodlust. These people were monsters, animals. I have to save them, he thought. Save them from themselves.
Jesus dies on the cross. His eyes were closing, heavy lids begging to blink their last. Ragged breaths escaped his lungs with less frequency. He was dying. Soon. Very soon. He looked out one last time and saw his mother Mary kneeling at the cross alongside his beloved disciple. He nodded toward the disciple and spoke to his mother with a weak voice. "Mother, behold your son." He will care for you. He looked over to the disciple and said, Behold, your mother now. His throat closed, he was so thirsty. Had he asked for water? The soldier standing near him had soaked a sponge and lifted it to his lips. He drank it in, only to taste vinegar and gall. A final insult. Crying out and spitting, he cried, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Then he bowed his head and he whispered, It is finished. Nothing left to say, nothing left to do. There was only death. He closed his eyes and died.
The afternoon sky was dark as night, with roiling clouds and threatening lights. Lightning flashed and thunder clapped, disrupting the silence following Christ's final words. A distant crack of stone echoed from the temple. A lone centurion at the base of the cross knew without a doubt that the man named Jesus had breathed his last. Surely this man was the Son of God. Lord, have mercy upon us. He dropped his spear and walked away weeping. At the foot of the cross, Mary cradled the broken body of Jesus. She remembered them taking him down, letting him fall as the nails were removed. She rolled him into her arms and sat holding him just as she had when he was a babe. His blood stained her cloak, the wind from the sudden storm whipping it around like a flag of defeat. Mourning could not stand next to her. Sadness was a welcome companion compared to her grief. From now on, I shall be known as Mara, she muttered, for I am the embodiment of bitterness, and God has dealt me the bitterest of blows. So she sat all alone. All others, save the beloved disciple, had disappeared. It was finished.
Later that evening, after Mary had gone with the disciple, a rich man from Arimathea approached the body of Jesus. He had bought Christ's body a few minutes earlier, and as a disciple himself vowed to see it laid to rest in an undisturbed tomb. His men bore the body of Christ to the location, a secret known only to his followers, and set him down inside the empty tomb. Outside, the ground groaned as a giant stone was rolled over to cover the entrance. No one would harm him further. No one would desecrate his teacher's body. Inside, the darkness was temporary. A subtle light sparked from the inner tomb and then shone bright enough to shame the sun. With a wink, all went dark again, save for an illumined man silhouetted by light. He smiled. Death has no dominion over me. I am life, and they are saved.